Okay, folks, we're here for our last plenary session of the day. We're looking at Texas and the Clean Power Plan policy update. Our moderator is Kate Zerenner, and she is the manager of the Energy Water Initiative at Environmental Defense Fund. She leads EDF's Energy Water Initiatives, and Kate implements policy strategies to increase water and energy efficiency and clean energy options to reduce climate change pollution and water intensity. She serves on the City of Austin Integrated Water Resource Planning Task Force and the advisory board of the Smart Cities Council. Prior to joining EDF, Kate also worked on climate change and energy initiatives at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the U.S. Department of Defense. And she holds master's degrees from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, the University of Glasgow, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas. So, Kate, without further ado, if you'd like to come on up.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully this is a much anticipated panel. This is a big topic. So we're going to just kick it right off and let Doug give you some overviews about what the Clean Power Plan is, why we should care about it, and why energy efficiency needs to play a big part of that. Doug, for those of you who don't know, is SPEER's executive director. He's been one of the founders of SPEER and the director since 2011 when SPEER was started. SPEER covers Texas and Oklahoma. He's done a lot of work looking at how energy efficiency really fits into the Clean Power Plan. Prior to being part of SPEER, he worked for 5 years at the Capitol in both the Senate and the House. So, Doug?
All right, so I have the pleasure and the very easy task of just describing for you 3,000 pages of regulations and associated supporting documents in 10 or 15 minutes, so should be fairly easy, right? All right, let me pull up my presentation here. All right, so what I've tried to do here is basically start from the beginning. So I'm presupposing very little or no knowledge of the Clean Power Plan, kind of starting from the beginning. Sorry, excuse me. But then quickly moving into some details that get into how energy efficiency can or may not be part of compliance with the Clean Power Plan. So hopefully, if you really don't know anything about the Clean Power Plan, you'll learn something, you'll be comfortable with this. But if you already know a lot of the basic details, hopefully you also come away with something from this. So I am Doug Lewin, Executive Director of SPEER, one of the 6 regional energy efficiency organizations in the U.S. Like Kate said, it was founded 4 years ago. We have about 50 members from a wide variety of energy efficiency industries. You can see them here: utilities, manufacturers, state agencies, cities, academic institutions. Many of the people here in this room, thank you very much for your support of our work. So what are we going to cover? First, the basics of the Clean Power Plan, including some of the timelines. This is a long time horizon, right, with a goal out to 2030. So what are some of the key points and decision points and timelines in between now and then? How are the goals set? What is this whole thing about building blocks? What do those mean? So that's kind of some of the basics. And then, like I said, we'll get into some more details specifically about energy efficiency, though those of you that are interested in renewable energy, many of the things apply to those as well. And then I'll end with a few, about 3 or 4 really very key issues that have yet to be determined that will really, I think, in important ways make or break energy efficiency's participation in Clean Power Plan compliance, and by extension, make or break whether or not the costs of compliance are kept very low, whether or not economic development ensues, all those sorts of things. So we'll end with that. So what is it? It is a very rarely used section of the Clean Air Act. I once heard a national expert in this, Ken Colburn from Regulatory Assistance Project, to describe it as the 40-year-old virgin, because the Clean Air Act was written 40 years ago and really this section has not been used. It's been used a couple times, but in very minor ways, nothing like this. It is Section 111D, 111B is for new sources, 111D is for existing sources. There are over 3,000 pages. The rule itself is about 1,500 pages. The federal plan, the proposed federal plan and model trading rules are 750 pages, and then there's hundreds of pages of supporting documents. So it is very complex, and I'll do my best to make it simple and comprehensible. As with everything in the Clean Air Act, it is a state-federal partnership. And that really does mean something, right? I mean, the state-level EPAs are the ones that really drive compliance planning with the Clean Air Act. That is no different with this. However, like other sections of the Clean Air Act, if a state does not submit a plan or if that plan is found to be insufficient, then the EPA is required by the Clean Air Act to create a federal implementation plan. So, should the state of Texas decide not to create a plan, we will have one imposed on us by the EPA. So, if anybody is worried about sort of federal intrusion into the state's operations, the best way to prevent that is to create a state plan. So I'll talk more about that as we go as well. And each state has its own goal. It is enforceable at the end of the day on generators who are subject to civil penalties if they don't comply with the emissions limits. Why are we doing this? Why is this happening? Because the electric sector is the largest contributor to carbon dioxide emissions. This is a slide EPA uses a lot, just figured I'd show that. A couple of key milestone dates just in the next year. Actually, in just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks now. Oh boy, I got to get to work on those. Comments are due on the Clean Energy Incentive Program. Matt talked a lot about that this morning. It's a non-regulatory docket, so technically you can put in comments beyond December 15th, but EPA has indicated it would be really helpful if you got them in before then. And that is how the low-income, there's renewable energy in there, but there's also low-income efficiency programs, and there's a lot to be worked out there. I've got a slide later on that I'll talk about, but that's a key date to keep in mind. Comments due on the proposed federal plan and the model trading rules due January 21st. That is a regulatory docket. That is a hard deadline. Some point in the summer, the model trading rules are going to be finalized. EPA will not put out a federal plan until such time as they have to for a state. And of course, they're hoping that will not happen at all. But the model trading rules will come out later, at some point in the summer, but before state plans or state requests for extension are due September 6, 2016. I think it's widely expected that very few states would submit a full plan by September 6, 2016. Almost all the states will submit a request for an extension, and by and large, those requests for extension will be granted. I think Matt will talk a little bit later about some of the things that have to be done in order to get that extension granted, one of those which is a robust public participation process. This is another EPA slide that shows sort of the longer timeline, and I want to emphasize, I think the sort of key point here is that 7 years. The compliance period does not begin until 2022. That was something that was changed from the draft rule to the final rule, where originally it was a 2020 start date. They pushed that back 2 years. So there was a long time to get ready for this, and that's a really important point. The final emissions goal, of course, not until 2030. The other key one on there is if you do request an extension as a state, you do have to submit a final plan by 2018, September 6, 2018. So what are the state goals and how did they arrive at them? By the way, I should have said this up front. Some of this is confusing. If there's any questions you might have throughout the presentation, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions during. They basically said, what the Clean Air Act does is it requires you to make a best system of emissions reductions. And normally that's going to be a widget that you'd place on a stack, a scrubber, something like that. In the case of carbon, what they did was they basically said the electric system is the best system of emission reduction. And what they looked at was an increase at the power plants, block 1, a shift from coal to natural gas, having natural gas electric generating units reaching about a 70% capacity factor, and block 3, shifting generation to clean renewable sources. And basically what they did there was they took different regions and said, picked a state that was a leader in that and said, if you can reach this level, that's what they factored in. So they basically put these 3 things together, ran it through a formula, and came out with a performance rate which is measured in pounds of carbon per megawatt hours. In the draft rule, there was a fourth block, and it was energy efficiency. And they said that states that reach a 1.5% reduction in electric sales from efficiency programs are the leaders there, so we'll factor that in. In the final rule, they removed it. The basic reason was because they felt that it opened them up to various legal challenges and that sort of thing, and so it was removed. However, that is only for the goal setting. There's a lot of misperception about that, since they removed it as a building block, states can't use efficiency to comply. That is completely wrong. States can use energy efficiency to comply with the Clean Power Plan. And they were very clear with that throughout the final rule and the proposed federal rule. However, it's entirely up to states if they include energy efficiency. States are not required to do it, and it's entirely up to the states how they include it. Would they include things like building energy codes or combined heat and power or just utility programs or all of that, financing programs? All of that is up in the air and entirely up to the states. The proposed federal plan, if a state does not submit a plan or an extension for a plan and they get the federal plan, it does not include energy efficiency with the one exception of the Clean Energy Incentive Program, which is the low-income energy efficiency programs. Other than that, efficiency is not in the federal plans. Now, it's a proposed rule. Maybe in the final it will, but as it stands right now, efficiency is not part of those. That's a very key point. Another reason for the state to be working on a plan. So EPA set these goals. Each state has an option in how they calculate their goal. They can either do it through a mass-based or through a rate-based. So what does that mean? You hear these terms floated around a lot. In the simplest possible way you can put it, mass is going to take the millions of metric tons coming out of the smokestacks of electric generating units, which, to make it real for you, in 2012 was 240 million metric tons in 2012 in Texas. And then you have to reduce to an absolute amount, which for Texas by 2030 is about 190 million metric tons. A rate-based is a little bit different because it's going to measure the pounds of carbon per megawatt hour. The state can decide which route they want to go. And there are pluses and minuses to both, but the general tenor around the country is that most states are probably going to go mass-based. There's a few exceptions, probably the states that have new nuclear going in, South Carolina, Georgia, I think one other. They may go rate, but I think everybody expects that 80 to 90% are going to go mass just because it's a simpler way. At the end of the day, do you have this much coming out of the stack or not? The performance then is going to be, and this was a huge change from the draft rule to the final rule. In the draft rule, your interim period was a huge reduction. Almost 80% of your goal had to be met as an interim average. They changed that and made what's really more of a glide path. So you have a three different three-year sections divvied up. And so what that does is really allows for more of a phase-in. And I want to emphasize this number here, this 8% reduction, because that is really what Texas has to do 9 years from now. 8% reduction. That is less of a carbon reduction we've got over the last 9 years. So this is not radical or difficult. John's going to talk a lot more after me about how far along Texas can get with existing trends, but these are not really hugely steep reductions, especially when you factor in those interim performance periods. So what do the plans look like? What are these state plans? What is the extension going to say we're going to do, and what does the final plan actually have to look like? There's two main buckets you go with. One is one of the emission standards plans, a mass or a rate-based plan. There is another alternative, which it's widely expected most states won't choose, but I think is at least worth mentioning. It's called a state measures plan, where a state can basically say, we have a lot going on. We have building codes, we have utility programs, we have finance programs, we have all these different things happening, and we add them up and we say, you know what, these things are going to get us to that goal anyway. If they don't, we'll accept a mass-based program as a part of the federal program as a backstop with the federally enforceable measure. So, but, and this, I've got this on the next slide. I need to pause for a drink in a second here, but inclusion of these various things in a state measures plan does not make them federally enforceable. This was one of the biggest concerns states had, was if we create a plan and we say we're going to do building codes as a way of meeting that, normally when you put forward a compliance plan as a state, whatever's in there is going to be federally enforceable. Now are we saying the feds can come and enforce our building codes? We would never do that. We're not putting that in our plan. So EPA made very, very clear in the final rule, a state measures plan, those individual state measures are not federally enforceable. The only thing that's federally enforceable is the overall mass tonnage released. And if you don't get there through your state measures program, they would implement a program to reduce that on the electric generators, not on builders for, building codes and that kind of thing. So efficiency can fit into the state measures plan very easy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I don't think a lot of folks are going to go that way. But the rate-based, this is a quote from the final rule. Basically, with the rate-based, you can include energy efficiency directly. It fits into the formula. 1 megawatt hour of energy efficiency renewables added to the denominator, which makes that rate lower, right? Anything you put in the denominator is going to make your fraction lower. Oh, excuse me. So energy efficiency, it's actually pretty straightforward in a rate-based plan, but again, because a rate-based plan is generally more complex, you're doing a lot of math associated and a lot of EM&V and all that kind of stuff, the world seems to be headed to more of a mass-based system. So how does energy efficiency fit in a mass-based system? It's very complex, it's very difficult, and the answers are still being created. In a mass-based plan, energy efficiency and renewables are complementary measures. They don't need to have EM&V as they do in the last one. If you look at the check boxes up there, in a rate base, you have to submit to the EPA what your EM&V program is. Under a mass base, you wouldn't, because at the end of the day, they're measuring the mass amount of tons. So you don't have to include it. However, states may choose to include energy efficiency and renewable energy into their own mass-based plans. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. So trade ready, this is a big concept that was introduced, again, from the draft to the final rule as a result of a lot of the comments that came into EPA. In the draft rule, you had to ask for permission to trade with other states. You had to say, we have an agreement in place with Oklahoma and Louisiana, New Mexico, whoever, and we can trade emissions rates credits or emissions allowances across state lines. And EPA said, what we're going to do instead is say you have to meet a few qualifications, and if you do, you're trade ready and automatically can trade across state lines. You can only trade with other states that are, if you're rate, you can only trade with other states that are rate-based. If you're mass-based, you can only trade with other states that are mass-based. These model trading rules are meant to be, you can actually take them as a state and adopt them, and they would be what EPA calls presumptively approvable. They would approve it if you adopt that. So this is a really big point and feeds well into what John's going to talk about, which is Texas is on a path to compliance with business as usual. What if we ramp up efficiency in renewables and we're trade ready with other states? There's the potential that other states could actually be paying for additional efficiencies in renewables in Texas, which I think is a really big deal. All states that receive the federal implementation plan will be included in that trade-ready system. So what kinds of efficiency can contribute to compliance? We've been talking about them today. We'll be talking about them tomorrow. Basically, anything that's been talked about conceivably could help, certainly in a state measure, certainly in a rate-based, and also in a mass-based, if we got some things to work out, but it is possible to be able to trade efficiency in a mass-based. In order to do that, you have to have a registry. You have to have some ability to say, this project had these things done. What are these things? There needs to be some form of EM&V. You have to make sure that the savings are real, that somebody isn't claiming an allowance or a credit for something that did not take place. This was something that I worked very hard on last year and early this year, a commission, sort of a blue ribbon commission of utility executives and former elected officials and academic leaders, et cetera. Some of you in this room, I know David Claridge was on that. We recommended that the state create such a registry, not just for Clean Power Plan, but because we can claim credit for energy efficiency for other types of air quality compliance efforts like NOx and regional haze and these kinds of things. If you create a registry, you can track, certify, and trade energy efficiency allowances. You have to have some proof of EM and V. And then what you're doing is you're taking it from the sort of complementary measure where it just sort of generally helps, and you're making it an actual instrument that can be sold in a market and actually has value. So this is something we're working very hard on to make sure that it will happen. There are entities, one of them is called the Climate Registry. They're already doing this in European markets, and they're working with 6 states on a pilot in the United States. So now I'm to the very end of my talk. I've been talking for a while, and it's late in the day. Thanks for bearing with me. But I said at the end I would identify a few key issues. So I was kind of asked to do 2 things today. One is to give an overview. That's what I tried to do there. And now talk a little bit about, more specifically, about the issues facing energy efficiency if it's going to be allowed as a compliance mechanism. There's a key issue here in allowance allocation. Okay, so this sounds really theoretical or academic or something, but this is very sort of fundamental to this working. The way EPA has proposed to do allowance allocation is basically to say the allowances are going to be given to generators based on historical emissions. If you do that, I think there's a wide range of scholarly papers from economists about this. That is an economically inefficient way to do it. It provides free value to emitters. There are other ways to do it, and I think EPA would have liked to have done some kind of an auction, but they believe that all of the revenues would have to go to Treasury, which could cause, I don't have to explain why that would be a problem. But states could create auctions. States could also create something called output-based allocation, where basically you're saying energy efficiency and renewables are eligible for allowances. You're going to add that to the generation from emitters and basically divide that by the total number of allowances. So that's allowing efficiency and renewables in without taking a lot of value away from the generators, but some. There's also the ability to create additional set-asides for efficiency and renewable. There's another way, which I've just learned about in the last few days, that many national companies are working and submitting some comments on that would basically say that any efficiency and renewable projects that are certified and show up get allowances first, then what's left over is a portion to generators. There's different ways to do this that would include efficiency. And all of those ways, if you do any of those things, you are actually going to be keeping costs down because you're bringing more competitors into a market. So it has a benefit of keeping costs down. EPA does have some set-asides that are through the Clean Energy Incentive Program I'll talk about in a minute. Second of the 3 key issues, leakage. What this means, it's kind of a funny term, but EPA put it in there. What they're worried about is that there will be this dash to gas, that the way that generators will get out of this problem of regulation of existing plants is by building new ones, and that the carbon reductions will not be very big. So states that are submitting plans have to show that they've addressed this. One way to address leakage is to show that energy efficiency is a big part of your compliance plan, because what you're doing is you're bringing demand down. It means you don't have to build as much new generation. So this is a key inducement to states to using energy efficiency in their plans. Freely giving out allowances will not address leakage. Last of the key issues, there are many others, but these are the 3 I picked. Clean Energy Incentive Program, which I know Matt's going to talk this morning about, and we'll talk more about. This is in the final rule. What does that mean? It's not just in the proposed federal rule, so it's not just something that's proposed and going to be taken back. It is in the final rule. It's going to happen. But how it happens, still very much up in the air. What EPA said was they're going to set aside a total pool for renewable energy and for low-income energy efficiency. It amounts to about 300 million short tons. That's about 10 to 15% of the total, and they are going to match. So if the state of Texas does low-income energy efficiency programs, every 1 megawatt hour that's converted to a carbon tonnage reduction, you're going to get 1 matched from the federal government. Renewable energy is a 1 to 2 match. So for every 2 megawatt hours you generate in renewables, you're going to get 1 credit. There's a lot of unanswered questions about how that works. How do we define low income? Matt referred to that this morning. If you're talking about low income areas, is it only residential? Are you including schools and hospitals? Are you including small businesses? I could go on and on. There's a bunch of questions that need to be answered, and EPA is very genuinely looking for guidance and help on answering those questions. So conclusions. States have some big decisions to make. A few, do you submit a plan? Do you ask for an extension? Or again, do you, I don't, invite to be the wrong word, but basically require the federal government to do your plan for you? Obviously, I think that's a suboptimal outcome. I think most people in this room would agree with that. But if we don't ask for an extension, that is what will happen. Rate-based or mass-based? Again, I think most people are going mass-based, but there are some arguments in favor of rate-based which are worth discussing. States do not have to do the Clean Energy Incentive Program. I said it's in the final rule. It is. If a state does not choose to do renewables or low-income efficiency as part of their plan, the allowances that would go to match what that state did will probably be apportioned to other states. So we would be losing those and letting other states claim them, but you do not have to include it, so that's a key question. Include energy efficiency more broadly. CEIP is low-income efficiency, but what about other kinds? Do we include that or do we leave it out? And how do we distribute those allowances? Do we just give them freely to emitters based on historical emissions, or do we find another way? There's a lot of work still to be done. These comment periods, one closes December 15th, another January 21. And again, big conclusion there is states have the power to make these decisions unless they choose not to make them, in which case EPA will be making them for those states. And there's my contact info.